Microsoft had a problem. Apple's iPod was dominating portable music. So Microsoft did what Microsoft does. It built a competitor. In 2006, Microsoft launched the Zune, hoping to take on the iPod and build its own music empire. But there was one problem. The Zune wasn't terrible. In some ways, it was actually ahead of the iPod. So why did almost nobody buy it? The answer is more interesting than you might think. When the Zune arrived, Apple had already spent years turning the iPod into a cultural phenomenon. People didn't just own an iPod, they knew what an iPod was. And behind it was iTunes, an entire ecosystem for buying, organizing, and syncing music. Microsoft was entering that battle 5 years late, but Microsoft believed it could still compete. The first Zune had a 30-gigabyte hard drive, a larger screen than some competing players, an FM radio, and something the iPod didn't have: wireless sharing. Two Zune users could discover each other and temporarily share music. It was a clever idea. Microsoft even built a subscription music service around the Zune. On paper, the company had a serious competitor. But technology wasn't the real problem. The problem was that Microsoft was trying to sell a product. Apple was selling an ecosystem. If you already had an iPod, your music was already in iTunes. Your computer worked with it. Your friends had iPods. And the entire experience was built around one simple idea: buy music. Put it on your device. Take it with you. Microsoft had to convince people to leave all of that behind, and the Zune didn't give most people a good enough reason. In its first week, the Zune briefly reached second place in the US portable media player market, but Apple was still miles ahead. The iPod had about 63% of unit sales during that launch period, compared with about 9% for Zune. And that early momentum didn't last. Microsoft kept trying. There were new Zune models, there was the Zune software, there was the Zune marketplace, and in 2009, Microsoft released the Zune HD. And this is where the story gets interesting. The Zune HD was actually well designed. It had a beautiful OLED touchscreen and a sleek interface. Reviewers liked it. But by then, Microsoft wasn't simply fighting the iPod anymore. It was fighting the iPod Touch. And that meant Microsoft was no longer competing just on music. It was competing on apps, software, and an entire platform. Apple had already built the ecosystem. Microsoft was still trying to catch up. There was another problem. Microsoft kept the Zune hardware heavily focused on the United States. That made it much harder to build the kind of global user base Apple had created, and the numbers told the story. By 2009, Microsoft's share of the US digital music player market was only around 2%, while Apple's iPod was above 70%. The Zune wasn't becoming the next iPod. It was becoming the next forgotten gadget. In 2011, Microsoft finally stopped developing Zune hardware. The Zune brand itself didn't disappear immediately. Its software and music services were folded into Microsoft's broader strategy, including Windows Phone. But the standalone player was finished. And that was the real lesson. Microsoft didn't lose because it made a terrible product. It lost because it entered a market where the winner had already built the ecosystem, the habits, and the loyalty. The Zune had some great ideas, but great features aren't always enough. Sometimes being late is the biggest mistake of all. And that is why Microsoft's attempt to beat the iPod became one of its most forgotten products.